that. So welcome to the APCG Colloquium. We're so glad everybody agreed to participate. As you all know, we're discussing Jeremy's paper, Identifying the Rich, Civil Registration and State Building in Tanzania. It's been available online, so for anybody who wasn't a direct participant, I hope you were able to download it. I'm seeing Jessica, are you here?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, welcome.
Thanks.
Were you able to download and read the paper?
I downloaded it and read half of it.
Okay. Jeremy and I were talking about whether he should do a full presentation or just sort of do a brief introduction. And I think we've opted for a brief introduction. So he'll just give us a little bit of context and background for the paper. And then we'll go ahead and give Kimuli and then Lucy about 15 minutes to give their formal feedback and comments on the paper. And then we'll just open it up to everybody and have a, why?
15 minutes each?
Oh, is it, or less?
Okay.
Did I give you a different time amount?
Oh, you said 10, but it's okay.
10. Okay, 10 minutes each. That's great. More time for all of us to discuss.
I'll take what I can get.
Sorry about that. So go ahead, Jeremy. Why don't you just give us some background on the paper then?
Sure. So thank you to Natalie and Naomi and Andy as well for organising and putting up with my delinquency and submitting the paper on time, and also to Kimuli and Lucy for agreeing to discuss. It's greatly appreciated. So I'm a fourth year graduate student at Harvard's Government Department, and kind of working on political economy of development in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is a paper slash might eventually be a chapter of the dissertation, where I'm kind of loosely looking at similar things in a few other countries around kind of identification and legibility in a couple of countries. Tanzania, obviously, this paper, and Liberia, another paper, and possibly Uganda as well. This is the most developed of those papers, and it's also the first time that this is kind of being exposed, I guess, to people outside of my immediate kind of advising network and so on. So I'm very curious to hear kind of any feedback, to be honest. And I mean, I've been working on this for kind of started the idea for this about 9 months ago or so, and then did some field work, mainly archival work over the summer in Tanzania to try and flesh out my understanding of some of these reforms and so on a bit better. So yeah, that's about all the background, I think. If you have particular questions to understand the motivation or anything like that, I'd be happy to go into it. But I look forward to any comments that you have on how to improve the paper.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. Kimuli, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Just give me 1 second. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to discuss this paper. It's really I really enjoyed it. So Jeremy asks, when do states seek to? Can you guys see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. So Jeremy asks, when do states seek to identify citizens, and when will citizens seek to be seen? And I like the argument that he makes, which is essentially redistributive politics drives this tension between identification, drives sort of who will seek to be seen and when citizens will seek to see the state. I'm going to talk a bit more about the theory in detail in a second, and it's Jeremy's this paper does very well in the beginning is sort of set out its contributions, not just to sort of political science and the literature on state building, but also to literature I was unaware of on research on the benefits of civil registration and the drawbacks to achieving full civil registration. And I'm going to and it also, and I think one of the most interesting contributions is to this notion that, I mean, we now sort of understand better that redistributive politics complicates state building, but it's not just that redistributive tensions make states weak, it also affects who states cover, which is, I think, a really nice idea, or how, or where states are strong. And I'm going to, so just to summarize my comments, even though I really like this paper, I believe both halves of the paper. So the empirical part, which I'm going to talk about less, seeks to sort of credibly identify the effects of registration using reforms in Tanzania in 1966, basically increases access to the registration of births in certain districts and not others. And I believe the empirics that you're measuring the benefits of registration in certain domains for the most part. And the theory makes a lot of sense to me. I just don't know that they go together very well. And I'm going to sort of try to describe why I think that's the case. Okay, so what is the theory? Oh no, how do I advance this now? Okay, there we go. Okay, so Jeremy's theory is that states want to know their populations in order to achieve three goals: to collect revenue, to provide services, and to administer elections. And the elections part sort of floats in and out of the paper, but really doesn't. And I'm sure that I'd be interested to hear about how it reoccurs in other parts of the project. But basically, it's a tension between collecting revenue and providing services in this particular paper. Civil registration facilitates collecting and making claims on revenue. And so there's a comparison, again, not made as explicitly as I'd like, between civil registration and censuses. And for some reason, civil registration is particularly suited to enabling the state to acquire revenue and to making people make claims on the state. Rich citizens face revenue demands when they're registered. That's another assumption. And so in order to induce the rich to register, states must either use coercion or offer regressive benefits, right? So, but as Jeremy notes, it's only at intermediate levels of development that states can act as gatekeepers, right? So a gatekeeper state offers regressive benefits because it's unable to use coercion, right? And because it offers benefits at all, unlike a very, very weak a state of very low development, it acts as a gatekeeper. And so what are the implications of this theory that he outlines? So the first is that the rich-poor gap in registration should be highest at intermediate levels of development. And he shows this in figure 1. I wasn't sure what the source of the data for figure 1 was from the paper.
Sure.
And then the real sort of empirical part of this, the implications he discusses in the paper more in depth are what happens at intermediate levels of development when you increase access to registration. And so the first is that it should be more likely to induce the rich to register, which is what he tests. The second two observable implications I'm a little more uncertain about. So the second one is that it should allow the rich who are induced to register to benefit most from regressive policies. And I think some of the confusion is in how the text is written. So on page 10, he says, rather, I test several observable implications closely consistent with this theory, drawing on a highly relevant reform. Most importantly, I seek to provide rigorous causal evidence of both the differential selection of the wealthy into eligibility following shocks to registration infrastructure and the regressive benefits they accrue. And it took me a while to sort of figure out what was moving here. And it seems like it's assuming that benefits are aggressive. And so if the rich are induced to register, we're going to see them, hypothesis 3 follows, returns to registration are targeted in areas of particular utility for the rich. So that was, I think, could be stated more clearly, but then there's a hypothesis 4 in the rest of in the empirical section of the paper that isn't in the section where he discusses implications about taxation. And that seemed like it was an assumption of the theory, not an implication of the theory. I would have liked that to be clearer. But let's just talk a bit about the theory and the assumptions that are made in this theory, because it's, even though I like it and it makes a lot of sense to me in some ways, I think it's worthwhile sort of like, kicking the tires on some of the assumptions that Jeremy makes. So it's weird to talk about, strategic actors in a theory when you have parents and children, right? This is the registration of babies rather than adults who might face tax. And so it sort of assumes that parents are quite far-sighted about what registration might mean for their offspring. And I'd have liked to hear more. I'd like to see it acknowledged more in the paper. And this also raises the question of what I, as a parent, might get from registering my child, right? If we're in a world where registration rates of people are low, do I make myself more visible to the state by registering my own child? And what does that mean for your theory, findings, whatever? There's also sort of an assumption about the motivating power of birth certificates. So, now I, as a baby, inherit this birth certificate from my parents, and it somehow makes me more willing to makes me more able to make claims on the state. And to the extent that we want to think about, how being seen by the state affects political behavior, is this a really strong assumption? Are we sort of assuming that possessing a birth certificate really does a lot. And, a question I had to ask myself was, if we're talking about the wealthy or the relatively wealthy, is the bar to my seeking state services really the absence of a birth certificate? Is that the deficit that bites most when we think about claims making, particularly for the wealthy? It also is the states are also strangely far-sighted in this theory, right? Which is strange because if we're thinking about states at intermediate levels of development, facing popular needs, why are questions of civil registration so important? And indeed, as you show in the case of Tanzania, they don't seem to be all that important, right? And so research on fiscal capacity suggests that one of the reasons it's hard to build is, in states with weak fiscal capacity, bureaucracies aren't institutionalized, and politicians may not have an incentive to take the long view. So the sort of far-sighted state you imagine in your theory seems inconsistent with some of the things you're assuming about some other things you're assuming about the state. I thought that would be worth going into. And then finally, it's one of, to what extent is the state really, really being strategic versus rationing for services that people value, right? Because it all seems like there's some sort of cunning plan in play. Maybe it's linked to the first point about long-sighted states. And in principle, like how do we distinguish a story in which states are acting strategically from one in which resources are constrained? So for example, the theory implies that states pick domains in which to require birth certificates to exclude the poor. But all the domains you identify are areas in which are valued by everyone, right? So the theory implies it would be sensible policy for the state-intensive redistribution not to require birth certificates for university entrance or travel. Is that really the case given how much people value university entrance or travel and the potential costs of abuse and fraud in those areas? So what I'm trying to suggest is that the benefits are regressive by accident and not by design, and I was trying to think how you would even know the difference, right? Moving forward, let's try to think about alternative reasons why we might see alternative reasons for registering births. And I think one thing that's really not addressed in this paper is that all the reforms that I could see don't just relate to the registration of births. They involve the registration of births and deaths, right? Is it ever the case, even in 1966, where the state alters the rules about registering births without altering the rules about registering deaths? And I think once we think about registering births and deaths, it sort of changes, like I can think of alternative explanations, alternative reasons why anyone would choose to be registered, or why the state would choose to register people, right? Because again, babies are only problematic sometimes. So the first is the facilitation of inheritance, right? So, for rich people who live in urban areas, does possessing a death certificate facilitate the probate process? I'm guessing it does, right? And if so, it's not surprising, as you saw in your tables, that in places where people who lived in these districts where you had expansion of registration have access to formal property rights, right? And then the second point is linked to the first point, right? Which is that, does registering births facilitate inter-household conflict? So just to give you a concrete example, at least I know in Kenya, when a man passes away, a woman passes away, one of the things you have to do to get probate assured is to get the area chief, to list all of the children the children that person has. And so in a rural area, that's easier because there's an assumption that people aren't moving around, and there are no sort of secret hidden children that there are no children of a man that unscrupulous relatives can hide or can conceal information about, right? This is actually direct experience. But unfortunately, people who live in cities or who are born away from rural areas don't have a chief to certify that they're certify paternity or maternity. And when you combine this with, so to step back and restate the point, people who live in rural areas, children born in rural areas may have an easier time establishing parentage, particularly at the point of inheritance, than children born to people living in urban areas. And so one of the things I thought was really interesting is, and separately from inheritance, just within resolving inter-household conflict, it could be the case that producing a birth certificate helps a woman establish the parentage of her child, right? Which could lead to sort of further benefits, specifically again for relatively wealthy mothers in urban areas. So I thought it was quite interesting that your placebo test in Table 4 shows that having a deceased mother rather than having a deceased father reduces your likelihood of being registered, right? It suggests there's some sort of gender intra-household dynamic happening here that might potentially be quite important, and more important for the kinds of people who might be registered, especially in cities. And then finally, there's nothing, the state, you talk about the state's function, facilitating distribution, but you sort of don't really discuss simple questions of public order, right? So maybe the case that registering births, and more particularly deaths, facilitates public administration where populations are in flux. So in Figure 2, when you show how these 1966 districts don't really differ or do not differ from whether reform is implemented differ or do not differ from other districts, one thing that I've been curious to see is internal migration. So you talk about population growth and population size, but not population flux. I think that point is less troublesome from your theory than the first two. But I think these seems like, to me, more plausible reasons why, not why states would make, so the last is the reason why the state would make registration available, but the first two are more reasons why people would opt in or out would register their children, would register births and deaths, particularly in urban areas. Okay, so I have a few smaller points. So there's a weird, so there's this match between your theory and your identification strategy. So I know, so your identification strategy in the paper is potentially in tension with the theoretical argument here, right? Because your claim is going to be that in Tanzania in 1966, no other policy was changing other than civil registration. But if it's really the case that, states register people strategically, that seems unlikely to be the case, right? And at a minimum, when you sort of when you finally finish collecting data on what other policy changes were enacted at that time in these districts, I think it would be most important to see policies regarding the registration of deaths and population control more generally, things like internal migration. So colonial legacies are sort of, you mentioned them like at periodic points along the paper. You talk about the gatekeeper state, but it would be nice that if you're going to mention them to sort of, I feel that there must be, if historical experiences with taxation are making all people or even just wealthy people aware of legislation, then there's potentially some variation here that you could exploit, and that might be worth thinking about. So places where, for example, people left Tanzania from Burundi and Rwanda, places where the colonial state had a much more coercive and extractive sort of form. I would also like to see more on the taxation outcomes. So, you find that people who are registered are more likely to pay council tax, but I mean, is this really the best outcome for your theory about allocation decisions by the state, right? Because there's sort of the link between the payment of council tax, and Lucy can say more about this than I can, and holding a birth certificate seems to be quite a tenuous one. And then finally, the section on responses to democratization. I really didn't feel that it added very much to the paper, unless one, as a piece of evidence on it in itself, and also, it would seem, it would be more satisfying if you could go further along, if you could say more about why anyone should truly believe, the theory. The shift to multi-party politics was going to change distributive politics in Tanzania at the time. So I think with that section, I would either flesh it out more clearly or remove it because it's sort of a distraction. But in general, I found this a really, really exciting project. I really like the careful empirics, and I'd be interested to see how this broader theory you have fits at how you apply your theory in these other contexts that you mentioned earlier. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Shall I reply quickly to a couple of points, or should I go to Lucy now?
Let's hold them for now and go to Lucy and let her go ahead and give her comments, and then you can reply to both if that's okay.
Yep, of course, thank you.
Okay, so I do not have slides, but questions before I go through the comments. Kamuli making me look bad.
No, I asked Naomi. Well,
So I may just not have read my email carefully enough. So Jeremy, I really enjoyed reading this paper. I think it's a really interesting topic. It's one I haven't seen a lot of work on, and I like the way you're tying it into the state building literature. I have some larger comments or sort of groups of comments on the framing, the theory, and the empirics. So I agree with Kamuli that you do a nice job at points of the introduction of really tying this paper into these big literatures on state building and development. I do think the paper would benefit from bringing that up front more. So right now in the abstractions of the first couple of pages of the paper, it's not necessarily obvious why we should really care about civil registration, other than those of us who just find it interesting inherently. And so I would really think about ways to kind of just put that up front, maybe start with the puzzle of like, look, the state has a lot of benefits that they could get from registering people, from increasing legibility, and yet we don't see them doing that systematically. So why has this been so hard to move when other areas of development, maybe they've made more progress? And you could bring in things like Ujama and where the state has actually successfully done some really big projects, but this is an area where we're not making as much progress, and why is it? And maybe to use the case of Tanzania to motivate that this is just a broader issue, and it's one that's been surprisingly intractable despite the benefits that we think would be there for the state. And presumably this is something that donors really want as well. And so it's really not saying, I'm not saying to necessarily change the substance, but just sort of reorder so that it's really obvious up front why we should care about this and what your contribution is going to be. I agree with Kamuli that there's sort of a disconnect between some of the broader framing and the theory, and then the second half of the empirics. Because right now, one of the big claims of the article is that it's going to be very strategic to not register these poor citizens. But then the evidence is much more about, look, registration in Tanzania is more appealing to the rich versus poor, with some evidence about the effects on economic and political outcomes. And so what's happening right now is that in some ways you're setting up the paper to do something that's really exciting, but it's just really hard to prove, especially so long as you're focusing on the single case of Tanzania, showing that systematically we're going to have, in different settings, these different strategic outcomes about when the state wants to really make its population legible. That's just going to be very difficult to do using the micro level data. And so we can talk more about the best way to deal with that. One way might be bringing out some of the more spending more time on the cross-national part, doing more, instead of just descriptive, kind of doing more regression analysis and things like that. Or potentially sort of splitting this and having one paper where you really focus on this broader claim, and then making this more of a narrow paper on exactly what is registration doing, and using that kind of in the broader dissertation. But even if you decide not to go that route, anything you could do to really show that Tanzania actively does not benefit from poor citizens registering and actually face big costs for doing that, that I think that could really help sell that part of the paper as well. On the theory section, overall, it makes a lot of interesting points. I agree with Kamuli that I think there's a lot there with the overall theory. I did find it hard to follow at some points. I think right now it just needs to be, in some ways, you're writing well, but you're trying to make some of the points fairly subtly. I think you just need to hit people over the head with it, make it really explicit. This might actually be a nice argument to formalize, because it is, it's all about the costs and benefits for poor citizens, rich citizens, and the state. And it might help you to be able to go through it more systematically and really show these trade-offs if you can actually formalize that. And in particular, because one of your main arguments is this sort of inverse U-shaped relationship, I think that would be easier to draw out if you could actually formalize it and show that as GDP increases, potentially as incomes increase, that you're going to get that kind of trade-off. One of the ways I think formalization could really help is with the scope conditions for the theory. That right now, there's a sort of a tension in the paper between framing this as a very specific, this is a theory about Tanzania and here's how it works here, versus this is a general theory of when states are going to invest in this particular form of really critical state capacity. And I'm going to look at sort of what happens at one particular equilibrium that we maybe haven't thought about enough. But that would help I think that could really help pin down exactly what is it about the level of income or the level of state capacity that's going to get this. What are the necessary assumptions about the costs and benefits for poor versus rich citizens that are actually going to generate this result? And that will, I think, give you a bit more traction, help make the case of Tanzania more convincing for why you should be really looking at it here. Kamuli touched on this as well, but right now the least well-defined part of the theory for me is why registering poor citizens leads to increased demands on the state. It's just not necessarily, and it's definitely not obvious why that should be the case. I can think of some reasons, but I think the theory would really help from explicating that much more explicitly. Why is it that registering rich citizens either doesn't create more demands or creates demands the state can meet, while just the mere act of registering poor citizens doesn't? One way you could get there is through something like taxation, that if we think people are being taxed, they'd care more. But I do think I do think it might be worth going a bit more into the conditions under which we think registration would actually increase taxation, especially for poor individuals. If you look at the structure of the income tax system in a lot of developing countries, even the formal cutoffs for paying income tax are so high that most poor citizens are just never going to be affected by that. And if you look at the way these governments are taxing poor individuals, they're doing it mainly at the national level through consumption taxes, which doesn't require registration of individuals at all, especially the VAT's really set up so you don't have to do that. Or if we're thinking about council taxes, a lot of those are things, at least in sub-Saharan Africa, are things like market fees or business licenses that you wouldn't necessarily need a birth certificate to be able to collect. You can just walk around, someone has a shop, and you can tax that business. So I would think a bit more about the ways in which poor people would actually potentially face costs from registering, especially in terms of taxation. I think that could actually potentially help you, because right now there's sort of a tension where in some parts of the theory, you're drawing on so Jim Scott and others' work that the poor people really shouldn't want to register because of these costs. But then you're contrasting that with the fact that in Tanzania, like over half of households have sought some kind of birth certificate in the last year. So maybe what that means is what you want to argue here is we're really looking at the costs, not necessarily. When we're looking at the costs, it's really these formal barriers and not these informal future costs about taxation. And that might also help with some of Kamuli's points about when you would choose about parents and the state being really forward-looking in terms of registering people now.
Great.
So I do have some thoughts on the empirics. So overall, I really like your strategy. It looks like you've got really impressive data here. I mean, to have all these census data and I'm especially excited to see that you have such detailed data about people's tax burdens, because that's something that just doesn't exist for most countries. I think it's really great you were able to get that. In terms of the main analysis, I think right now you're using the entire population. So whether you're born in 1950 or 2000, you're included in the sample.
That's right.
For comparability, I think it could really help to limit the sample to people born within, say, 5 or 10 years of that window. So instead of comparing 70-year-olds to 20-year-olds, you're really just comparing around kind of a more narrow band. I think that'll make it a bit more like kind of discontinuity that you want to look at, and it's going to reduce a lot of concerns about some of the time trends and just everything else that's changing, not just in 1965 to 1967, but in all the time periods since. And because your sample is so big, I think you should still be pretty well powered to pick things up with that. So right now, are all the districts included, or just the ones where the change occurred?
All districts, but if they
Okay.
they're set to like untreated if they had a reform, if they weren't to reform in 1966.
Yeah, I might consider either sort of overseeing if you can do some matching on districts. I know it's really hard to get district level characteristics, or just to only look at treated districts and just look at pre and post, or something like that.
Okay.
Just to deal with the fact that these are richer, more urban districts. See if you can get more traction on it that way. I would have also just liked to see the overall distribution of birth year in the sample, because as we know, a lot of countries have such a youth bulge that just making sure there are enough people that old in this particular sample that you can really say something about what's happening there.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it might be good to talk a bit about missingness. I know a lot of surveys either have birth year or they have some kind of range for people who don't know their exact birth date, which is going to include a lot of older people. So if you could talk, just my guess is that's something that's going to come up in reviews, and you might just want to add a note mentioning that. In terms of the placebo tests, so the lags that you have in your main table, that's all in one regression. You have the original treatment,
yes.
and then you have lags.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
I might consider as an alternative looking at sort of different cutoffs, like if you considered treatment 1970 instead of 1966, something like that.
Sure.
Or considered it as 1964, and then looking at the band around that, so showing whether we don't see the same sharp shifts in that. And then so one more sort of smaller point. I did think the taxation finding was really interesting. You are finding that it's increasing taxation, but it's only robust when we're thinking about council taxes. And you find the same thing with political outcomes. So you have this national level policy that you're arguing is about the national level government really making these changes. But then at least some of the empirics are finding really strong effects for your interaction with local government, but not with the national government. I think it'd be really interesting. That's potentially just really informative. And I think it would give you some space to delve into that more, try and figure out what could be driving that and what that says about the effects of registration overall. And then finally, I do think that it would help to dig more into some of these alternative mechanisms. And Willie raised quite a few of them. But I could also just guess that you're going to find similar patterns in terms of the rich versus the poor in a lot of different contexts. So I was thinking about voter ID laws in the US. This is something where the US is a very high capacity state. We overall do have, I guess, what you could call coercive registration. But when you have these voter ID laws, you're again finding sort of similar patterns that the people who don't have formal government IDs are people who tend to be obviously a lot older, but also typically people who are poor, people who may not have a birth certificate, may not have these other things. And so drawing on that, if you can figure out some ways to show that that's not just what's going on, right? That I worry that you're going to get pushback that even in developed country contexts, just the marginal cost of registering, of getting these documents is always going to be lower for a rich person than a poor person. The barriers will always be higher for the poor in some way. And showing that just that fact can't explain what you're finding there. Find some kind of testable implication that's different that can separate it from something like a voter ID law example in the US. I think that would really help strengthen it and then tie this micro level evidence more to your macro level theory as well. But overall, it's a great paper and I really enjoyed reading.
Great.
I'll let Jeremy go ahead and respond.
Okay.
Yeah, plenty to respond to, but thank you both for such thoughtful and detailed comments on the paper, many of which I agree with and was at least partially aware of, but it's good to have reinforcement. Yeah, so in terms of a few, maybe I'll start with some of Lucy's ones to begin with, and go backwards. Thanks for the comments on the empirical comments, Lucy. I've actually kind of tried a lot of this stuff already, but I should maybe add more to the appendix. Things are fine if you do a kind of more RD style, like restricted bandwidth type of stuff. Both your sample, you're right. That's a good point. I should include that. That's why I'm kind of preferring to use the census rather than the household survey data, which is much smaller sample. And you're right. Once you start looking back a long time, then obviously the sample's getting quite small. On missingness and lumping, you do get a lot of it's less missingness, it's more that people are guessing at intervals of 5 years, which is kind of what Melissa Lee is using and Nanjang using their paper in JOP from a year or two ago. Great suggestions on some of the stuff around like local taxation and stuff like that. I hadn't thought about that, and I'll look into that more. The comments on formalization, I have been thinking about formalizing this for a while because I think you're right. I think it could benefit from doing that. Additionally, the comments on kind of this is related to more equally to Kanuli's comments on kind of the theory versus empirics, I guess. Useful comments on the cross-country versus the within-country stuff. Those are great suggestions, and I'll definitely look into them more. I think that both of you are sort of raising what might be termed, like both of you are alluding to kind of this alternative explanation, which is closer to where sort of bureaucracy structurally disadvantages the poor in terms of like imposing demands on literacy and so on, which are just, they're not necessarily strategic things that states do. This is more just that like there are higher costs of interacting, and this is just another case of that. I need to give this some more thought on how to actually kind of just use that argument, because I mean, it's been made in the literature more in kind of anthropology, I guess, than especially like, yeah, certainly a lot in kind of history and anthropology. And it's not obvious to me right now how to completely dispute it, because it does lead to a pretty similar set of observable implications. I think that some of the evidence from the reform I'm using should kind of, I can probably stress that a bit more to try and suggest that it pushes against that. Camille, on your excellent comments about the theory, tiny one, stuff like the sources, this is generally taken from like cross-national, the World Bank has like an ID for development unit, which is producing this data, but I should cite that. Stuff on civil registration versus the census, thanks for the comment on stressing that more. I don't necessarily think that civil registration should increase the ability of states to extract revenues, but I think it should. Certainly, it has different effects on whether state empowering citizens to make claims on the state, i.e., whether you have a document proving your identity and eligibility for things is going to have a much larger effect on whether you're able to access the relevant stuff versus being enumerated in the census. But I think I can stress that much more in the theoretical section. And thank you for the framing on redistributive politics. That's way more elegant than anything I've written here. So I might just straight up just like quote your comments if I rewrite this. And the kind of the intermediate levels of development comments also taken very well. Your comments about kind of parents and children far-sightedness required, I think I would push back a little bit on, I think a common comment across both is a bit of a lack of clarity in some of the theoretical sections on what's an assumption versus what I think I'm able to show with the empirics. I think that I'm able to show to an extent that registration enables access to public services rather than, however, I think that you're right in that I kind of written it in terms of the theory that I'm kind of assuming that it does. And I think that I've already tried, this used to be less disjointed than it currently is between the theory and the empirics, but it's clear that I need to go quite a lot further to kind of demonstrate exactly what I think the empirics are buying here, because it's sort of like buying a kind of, there's a sense in which it's kind of like a consequentialist story of like, let's look at the consequences of this thing using this natural experiment. Yeah. Then I'm using that to kind of buy like a bit of a broader story. To the extent that was valid, I think I could write it a bit more clearly. On the comment about kind of whether it's more binding for the rich or the poor, I think that these things are relatively binding for wealthy individuals in a way that they're not for the poor. I'd say that if you look at survey responses on why people like don't have bank accounts, very few people are going to say it's about lacking legal identification. Many more would say that because they lack of kind of money to save. But I think that relatively, maybe this is another thing to formalize, would be that this is more important, I think, for the rich in terms of these barriers. But I could certainly formalize that better. Comments on death registration are really interesting. So the particular reform on these didn't do anything to death registration, but there is actually some interesting. I've spoken to a lot of policymakers who were involved in these reforms in the mainly in the 70s and 80s, because the 60s is going back a while. And all of them stress how much harder death registration was in Tanzania, at least, than birth registration, due to kind of suspicions, and especially in rural areas, around kind of traditional burial practices. And so I haven't actually thought too much about it, but I really like your comments on facilitating there on inheritance. I could actually try and push a bit more on the paper using my result on inheritance, but also the comments on like intra-household conflict I think are very interesting. And more broadly, I think that what you're pushing there is kind of is almost like a modernization type story of like in urban areas where there's more like mobility, you know, there's a shift to kind of individual level identification to keep track of people, to like maintain public order. There are books about the development of the stuff in Europe, which points to a very similar kind of story, and it's of how this stuff developed at least in Europe. And I think I could need to think about that a little bit more. But on the whole, I like fantastic comments from both of you, and I'm hugely grateful and would welcome any other thoughts. I guess my one question I'd be interested in anyone's feedback on is, given that there is clearly this kind of disjunct between theory and empirics, whether, kind of, I guess, Lucy, you suggested a couple of thoughts here on whether to sort of split this out into two. I don't really want to split it out into two. I kind of want to keep this as one thing. But if you think it's pretty clear that I should be doing that, or I am working on different stuff, which is kind of relevant to this stuff, to this material. I'm doing a piece in Liberia looking at biases and how polling stations were allocated spatially to kind of using a lot of data in the voter registers there and so on, and how that kind of differentially enfranchised wealthier and less wealthier individuals in the 2017 election, a couple of other pieces. So I kind of want to keep this as one connected bit, but other thoughts on whether this should be split into two, I guess, or into, or just dropping material, particularly usually the discussion on democratization, which I can kind of buy. I'd be interested in those thoughts.
Well, we can go ahead and open to everybody that's here, unless Kamuli or Lucy, you have a specific suggestion on splitting the paper.
So, I think you should keep working at keeping it together for a while, because the theory that you have may produce additional. None of us can think of how you could distinguish your theory from bureaucratic constraints, but maybe someone else will. I think another word for consequentialist is functionalist, which sounds. And so, yeah, if you keep them together, you're going to get, and maybe deserve that objection. But I don't know. I don't want to counsel pessimism, so keep at it. So that somebody else can weigh in. Lucy?
Yeah, I think it makes sense to keep pushing on this for a while. I don't know if this helps with. I had one thought. So Kamuli mentioned, looking the colonial legacies and taxation in different areas. One thing you might look at is Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda all had some form of holdover of the colonial poll taxes for differing lengths of time. Uganda didn't abolish it till 2005. And you might consider, because what that's going to do is create so the first stage is sort of, was payment of that actually tied to any kind of registration? My understanding is the tax collectors just went around and bullied all adult men until they paid pretty coercively. But you might find that there's some link to sort of legibility or formalization with the state there, in which case you could potentially see if you can get traction on how its elimination changed things. In Kenya, it happened much earlier. I want to say like 1978, but I could be off by a decade or two on that. But I wonder if that's something where you're changing the costs and benefits to that, and you could look at how that affects things. I don't know if that totally helps you with the idea of sort of state capacity and it being strategic. But it might, if you looked at I figure the more cases you look at, the more chance you can find something that some kind of differential implication.
Yep, thank you.
Do other participants, Naomi or Jessica, have comments?
Yeah, I have a couple. This is Jessica. So one thing I was thinking about is why, if the state is weak, and you're making this argument that it's mostly weak states to which this theory applies, why would rich people believe that they will gain access to services if they register? So it seems like there might also be some strategic coordination problem going on here, where only if enough rich people register themselves, then would the state have sufficient fiscal revenue to then deliver stuff. So just thinking a little bit about that component. Since it seems like the poor are, in your story, worrying about having taxes later on, the rich should also be. Then the second comment I had is similar to, before that, I was missing a little bit of politics in the both story. So you have the government as an actor, but it's unclear what kind of government actor this is. I actually didn't get to the part in the end where you talk about democratization, but I think that has like the regime type and the incentives of the government have a lot to do with their strategic behavior, and you're sort of silent on that in the front part of the paper. And I think part of that gets into this idea of scope conditions and being clear about under what conditions will this theory hold. And I haven't actually thought it all out, but I do think it matters a lot. And it goes back to this idea that Lucy raised, which is why registering poor, why registering poor citizens should lead to increased demands on the state. And I would think that argument or that assumption would be more valid in a more democratic context, where now you have an electoral mechanism through which you can demand stuff from the state. But if it's during this authoritarian period, what actual ways?
One party democracy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. So hearing more about what the state is trying to maximize and what they're actually afraid of in terms of claims and claims making, and is this like, are they afraid of revolution? Or I was unclear as to how registering poor people could serve as a threat.
Okay, so on the coordination comment, you're right. It's kind of like almost like you could imagine some kind of tipping point type model where you don't want to be the first person to do this kind of stuff. There's kind of possibly risking exposure without getting much in return. But if everyone else has already done it, then it's kind of the marginal. The state is both more able to enact these kind of barriers or gatekeep stuff, and also you're differentially losing access. I'm not sure totally how I can get it that directly through the empirics, but I'll give it a bit more thought. Because you're right, I'm sure that there is part of that story here. In terms of
is there spatial variation in, like, if you're in a district that's surrounded by districts that it's getting the reform, maybe you think that this is a much wider initiative than if you're out on your own?
Yeah, I suspect you'll be underpowered to look at anything like that, but I'll try and think about that more. In terms of, I guess I didn't really address this comment very well before, and kind of registration facilitating access to demand from the state. I mean, that's going to be both a function of whether this is like imposed, whether this like is a thing which is required for access to particular public services, which I'm suggesting should only follow this kind of regressive pattern. And so there's kind of the question of like whether it's directly to be relevant, because there's lots of literature around, people in the register, it's instrumentally useful for them to access stuff. And I guess part of the paper is saying that decision isn't exogenous, is a decision which governments take quite specifically, and a lot of governments recently have been demanding this stuff for access to like cash transfer programs, for example, which are inducing poorer people to register children in order to make claims to access cash transfers. That's the kind of the story of Hunter and Brill and World Politics in 2016. Other channels of increasing demands on the stage, I'm looking at things in different contexts and trying to get variation, for example, on whether citizens have been issued national identity cards in Uganda and looking at how that increases their access or expectations of delivery from the state. And I'm not sure whether I can, what the quality of the evidence I'm going to be able to provide in this paper is, but it is something which I have at least like some evidence towards, and should at least probably try and substantiate a bit more in this paper. So I don't consider it to be like an implausible claim, but I guess the evidence for that I'm justifying it with here is still a bit thin.
I also should have said that I think this is a fantastic paper. I think that I don't remember who said it, but there's not a lot of writing in this space, and so you're offering a really useful set of theoretical concepts to a space that very few exist. And I've been thinking about similar things and writing similar things, and when I read this I was like, yes, thanks for providing some evidence for a piece of this huge puzzle that we're all trying to work on. So I think it will do well, and I'm excited you're working on this.
Great, thank you very much.
Could I jump in? Hi, this is Naomi.
Hi.
Hey. So again, also just super interesting paper, and it's so I had a couple questions based upon table 4 and 5, which is on page 28.
Yep.
So if
Yep.
so, given the okay, so I think part of this is could this have been analyzed as a within family difference kind of analysis where siblings born before or after 66,
Yep.
where all kinds of family things are held constant, is really the sample you're looking at?
Yeah, so that's what table 4 of column 4
That
of
table 4?
3. In table 3, the first stage robustness table, there's column 4 has household fixed effects, so that's identifying off of within family variation and whether they were born pre or post.
But really restricting to families that only have siblings born in before and after. So only
yes.
Parents, yeah. Is that what
exactly.
that is?
So that's member. So that'll be that won't necessarily be kids, because if they're born before pre and post 66, and they're probably not in the same household now.
I
so
see.
That'll be more like
okay. So it's not possible. So it's not possible
like
out of the IPM sample to find anything like this, or the kind of thing that people, what's it, DHS kind of thing. I guess this isn't collected on that.
I mean, DHS only collects registration status for kids under 5 rather than for adults.
Okay.
I mean, I'd be able to try it. There were the final districts had this reform passed in 2009, and so you could plausibly try something like that there. But obviously, you're not going to be able to get any interesting outcomes on the kind of political economic outcomes for kids born around 2009, probably.
Okay.
So yeah, that's just kind of like within spouse partner variation.
Okay. And then within, so I really like the fact that table 5 is there. Like, it's really, like, I think it helps tell the story so well. And something I expected to see in there was gender of the person.
Oh, right.
Actually. Are boys differentially registered from girls?
I don't think there was any variation in that. I'll check that though, that should be in there.
So this leads me to this question of, so if it's, so why are parents not registering one or the other more if they think it's about access to higher education or other kinds of access to the state in this kind of high level, which boys are more likely to be able to access in the future?
Yeah, I should actually hold on. I need to check whether I can't actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I'm 50% sure that it was balanced, but I should check that.
50%.
I'm hedging my bets.
So I think part of telling the story of what is it that might have been, and partly it's just off of Kimberly's comments. What is it that might have been in the parents' minds, or what do you think your kid's going to get? I think a big part of it probably would be related to the gender of the child, or whether they're firstborn, or I don't know whether it's possible that firstborn or secondborn kind of thing exists. Is it the person who's going to take over the family farm, by tradition, or the second son who's going to have to go off and do something else, or I have no idea what it is around here. But I think some exploration in that kind of space might help you tell your story here.
Yep.
Well, one other way to think about that could also be, so are people actually being registered at birth, or do these regulations create spikes in registration of like 5-year-olds or something like that as well? Because it's not, or people who are 18 and now actually need these and are registering. I don't know if you have any survey data on how old people were when they got their birth certificate. No. That might be really hard to get.
No, so and I tried to get some of this out of the relevant government ministry and RITA in Tanzania, but was wildly unsuccessful. So, I mean, some other countries do that, but certainly not Tanzania. First of all, you definitely do see spikes in people trying to get the stuff when it's at ages where it's more instrumentally useful. For example, like 18 and stuff, trying to get them into university. Given that the structure of the exact reform, as I at least understand it, I think that it only actually applied to those born after a specific date. but I don't have evidence on exactly kind of compliance and non-compliance because obviously people can get this stuff later in life if it just gets harder and more expensive to do so than doing it at birth.
On the splitting paper question, I think you could write a really interesting paper about the Tanzanian state strategy that has nothing to do with, how people responded. And then just have a separate paper that's about how people responded.
Mm-hmm.
And so the how long you should push for trying to keep these two together, my preference would be not as long as maybe the others are suggesting. Because I can see how interesting this would be in two different papers, where the first one might help structure the rest of the dissertation, which has other components, but it doesn't have to exist as one. It's also a pretty long paper, and if you do a lot of the exploration on the detailed empirical side, that's going to need more space. And I think the kind of more background on the Tanzanian government. Or kind of more like what was happening in 1966. Any of those kinds of things.
I actually
more space.
I had a similar question about, there's a footnote about like how the reforms were discussed in newspapers, and I wanted to know what they thought they were doing at the time.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think I could actually add some because I went through the kind of microfilm of the relevant newspapers, and I have all the articles, so I can kind of add those to the end. But no, like there was a lot of stuff happening in Tanzania. And this is why I'm still in the process of trying to get together all these supplemental government notices and stuff to assuage concerns and exclusion of it. But yeah, like the late 60s kind of marked the turn towards socialism in Tanzania and so on. And so it was definitely like a very active period of Tanzania's political history.
If we're voting, I would agree with Naomi that I think if you're gonna put off splitting the paper, I would put it off not as long because I mean most of my comments. We have about a minute left, so I'll send you my comments. But most of them were structured around this idea of the agency of the state, and I think the paper really has. That's like sort of the biggest roadblock right now is being able to show that the state is really sort of trying to restrict registration for the poor. I mean, for all the points that have been pointed out already. And that there's like, if you're really going to make that point, there's a lot of work to be done. Whereas what you are showing is already really interesting. Showing the, differential benefits that accrue to for having a birth certificate is a very interesting question. I think that you could put more work around historical context and the theory about why that would be, and just not worry about sort of the state trying to restrict access to the poor. I mean, of course, it's something that needs to be talked about, but I think that if you stop making that, part of the empirical of the paper, then you have a lot more leverage on this already very interesting question.
Okay.
But I also told to address my comments, and we're at time. So, do you have any last questions for the group while you have us?
No, I'll let everyone get out exactly on time, but. Thank you all so much for these comments. If you might follow up with one or two of you individually, but it's been extremely illuminating for me to hear your feedback and some really, really excellent suggestions to look into as I develop this further. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you. And before we all take off, one last shout out to please advertise this colloquium the best you can. Have any scholars that on the continent who might want feedback on their work from an American or international audience, as well as any advanced grad students you might have who might benefit from this. Get the word out.
Okay.
Guys.
Great.
Bye.
Thanks so much. Bye.
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 Thank you.